We talk about social costs, and I think, I won't go through this in any detail. It's something that everybody in this room is aware of in terms of the social costs of imprisonment. The failure to deal and resolve issues around drug and alcohol abuse, the failure to deal with the physical, sexual and emotional violence that many people in prison have experienced as children and as adults, the prevalence of intellectual disabilities and mental health problems, so it's a typo there. Those figures are from New South Wales, but they're sort of common figures that you find. 60% of inmates being functionally illiterate and innumerate, long-term unemployed, low levels of education, high proportion of being previously in state care, and from the most seriously disadvantaged communities. So we know that they're the social costs that are compounded through imprisonment. Social costs, again, in terms of economics, has a slightly different meaning. I want to say a little bit about this, and I apologise if there's any real economists in the room. I'll probably be cringing and thinking of butchering an economic concept here, but I'll go ahead and do it anyway, because I think it opens up another way of thinking about social costs. When economists talk about social costs, they talk about the failure to properly take into account the negative social costs or external costs, and that failure leads to the overproduction of goods with high social costs. And the typical example I give is logging. So the logging of trees for timber can cause losses of recreation area, it can cause loss of good quality soil, loss of land to grow crops, erosion, pollution, loss of air quality. But that cost is not usually quantified and included in the price of the timber that's made from the trees. And so there's no incentive at an individual producer's level to factor in those external costs, the real costs of production. And so as a result of that, what you have is an activity that's performed more and more than it would be if the true accounting was there, if there was a true accounting. So you have the overproduction of something because of the failure to take into account the social cost. And what I'm suggesting here is that there is at least an analogous argument in relation to imprisonment. That governments do not acknowledge the real social costs of imprisonment. And they pass that cost actually onto the racialised and working class communities from which the incarcerated are drawn. They don't acknowledge the costs in terms of the individuals that are incarcerated, their families, or their communities. And they don't acknowledge the cost of reproducing crime and victimisation through recidivism that's compounded by imprisonment. And they also don't acknowledge the opportunity cost that I've already referred to, that for every person in prison, we do have less hospital beds or school deaths. So because the true social costs of imprisonment are not acknowledged or accounted for, we have this endemic overproduction of the prison as a strategy of containment. Governments simply do not meet the real social costs of imprisonment, and in fact they pass those social costs back to the impoverished communities from which they draw prisoners. They pass those costs back through lower standards of health, lower standards of education, and lower standards of housing. And I think when you then have private sector involvement generating direct profit through imprisonment, then the failure to factor in those social costs further exacerbates that tendency to overproduction. Okay, the last point I want to make in relation to what we're doing is around fear of crime. I just want to say one thing about fear of crime in a more general sense. I mean, fear of crime has many dimensions to it. And I put this slide up because this is it's a slide from the Kimberleys in northwest Australia, and it's a dance that's used in that area involving painting, and that dance expresses that community's fear of crime, although it's not immediately obvious from that reading. That was a community that was subject to massacres by state police and white vigilantes, and the knowledge of that massacre is passed on through the material culture of those people, through their dances and through their painting. So fear of crime has many dimensions to it, and the way we need to think about it, I think, we can think about it in different ways. I just put that up as an example of how one community expresses its fear of crime, its fear of state crime over a long period of time. However, going back to more traditional Western ideas about fear of crime, what we know and what we understand is that despite, and going back to this comparison between New South Wales and Victoria, despite all this public money that's spent in relation to imprisonment, are people in New South Wales safer? And do they feel safer than their compatriots across the river in the neighbouring state? Well, the answer is no. They neither feel safer nor are they safe. And the surveys that are done in terms of unreported crime and public surveys in relation to fear of crime consistently show that state with double the imprisonment rate, double the expenditure, is also a state where there's a much greater fear in the community of crime. Okay, so I haven't gone through, I guess, all the areas that we're using in terms of engaging with public debate. We've also got on our website a paper that Dave Brown has recently written on the limitations of the Prisoners Crime Control measure, and we're also working, Mel in particular is working on issues around justice reinvestment as, again, another aspect to engage in public discussions on this issue. I think I'll leave it there, and Ireland's going to go